I'm a scientist, a senior environmental scientist for the EPA. I've done a lot of different work for the EPA, cleanup of hazardous waste sites, managing the cleanup of hazardous waste sites, and for a couple of years I consulted with the U.S. Army to help them reduce the amount of pollution they were generating at their bases in Europe. And most recently I've been specializing in trying to put contaminated or formerly contaminated properties back into use by either encouraging very energy efficient building to go back onto them or to actually site renewable energy systems on formerly contaminated sites. Today I'm just going to give an overview of environmental protection in the United States, hitting some of the history of environmental protection and the highlights, and then we'll have questions at the end if you have any. So, a brief history of environmental protection in the United States. I would argue that one of the early heroes of environmental protection is President Teddy Roosevelt. He was president in the early 1900s, and he started the national parks. There's a quote that I like about Teddy Roosevelt. It goes that Henry David Thoreau read the writings of John Wordsworth. I think it's John Wordsworth. It's Wordsworth anyway. And then John Muir read the writings of Henry David Thoreau. President Roosevelt read the writings of John Muir, and now we have national parks. And I like that quote just because it speaks to the power of idea. And if you have a good enough idea, sometimes you just can't keep it down. Teddy Roosevelt also started the national forests. He looked at mountain fronts like we have here in Colorado and saw that they were heavily forested. And he thought about the water supply coming off of that, and he realized that if we had uncontrolled logging, timbering on all those mountain fronts, that it would really mess up our water supply, because you cut all the trees down, you get lots of erosion, it goes into the rivers, and it can clog up your reservoirs, it can make your delivery systems difficult to manage. So he realized that it was important that we manage our forests, so he started the National Forest for that reason. Anybody know who Rachel Carson is? She wasn't a president. Anybody know? She was an author. She wrote a book in 1962 called The Silent Spring. And a lot of people really think of her as a founder of the modern environmental movement, because The Silent Spring was about the effect that pesticides were having on wildlife. And the name Silent Spring comes from the fact that where she was living, she noticed there were a lot fewer songbirds in the springtime. And she traced that to overuse of pesticides. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get a little further along. So the Environmental Protection Agency was founded in 1970 by this guy. President Nixon, actually signed the legislation. Anybody heard of President Nixon? No. Yeah, he didn't leave office under the best of conditions. He was actually driven out of office, but not because he formed the EPA. It was other things that drove him out of office. And this guy, William Rucklehouse, was the first administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency. So EPA was formed in 1971, and then environmental legislation started coming around. There were a few bits of environmental legislation prior to 1970, but for the most part, for most of American history prior to 1970, the legislation that drove or affected contamination really had to do with common law. So if your neighbor is dumping a lot of chemicals into your stream, you could sue them for harming you. But if you were further away from that stream, or you were worried about the vapors and you couldn't really get a direct link, or there was no direct evidence, then it was more difficult to take that kind of case to court. So in the early 70s, when the EPA was founded, then we started getting national environmental standards. And EPA, there was a Clean Air Act in place when EPA was founded, but the first set of actual national air standards was instituted in 1971. Back to the Silent Spring issue, in 1972, EPA banned the use of the pesticide DDT. DDT was an especially notorious pesticide because of the way it accumulated. And Rachel Carson talked about this in her book Silent Spring. But there's a concept called bioaccumulation. So you can have a little bit of toxin, and it may not hurt you in a small quantity. And in fact, DDT may not hurt, may not kill all the insects that it encounters. But if they get traces of it in them, and then a bird eats that insect, and then or rather, say, actually a more likely scenario, say it gets into a river, and goes into a lake, and then the bugs in the lake start getting exposed to that contaminant, say DDT, and it doesn't kill them, it may slow them down or whatever, but then a larger fish will eat that, then a larger fish will eat that, and the DDT will accumulate in that larger fish system, and then the eagle will come and get its dinner, and it'll end up eating that big fish that has a lot of DDT in it, and that's the concept of bioaccumulation that just it starts out low on the food chain, but by the time it gets to the top of the food chain, those animals at the top of the food chain have a lot of contaminants in them. So DDT was a very notorious bioaccumulator, and it almost drove the American eagle to the brink of extinction. It got to the point where eagles could not lay eggs that were thick enough to actually allow the embryo to gestate long enough. And then EPA finally, in 1971, also started looking at automobile emissions. In '73, EPA started a phase out of lead in gasoline. Ethyl lead was put in gasoline from very early, and it basically helps the combustion process. But ethyl lead was put in lots of gasoline in the decades leading up to the 70s. And what we were finding is that you combust that gasoline, and the lead would come out of the air and deposit on the ground just about anywhere where the emissions were. And we can still, if you go out and take samples of a soil layer, for instance, you can go down a few inches and get to a layer of soil that was deposited in the early 70s and prior to that, and you can see the difference between the amount of lead that was in that soil and the amount of lead that was in the soil that was deposited after 1970 because of lead in gasoline. It was a very widespread source of lead exposure. Does anybody have an idea as to why lead's bad for you? Lead can really, well, it's bad for a number of parts of your body, but it can really affect the brain development of young children. So if you meet someone who's particularly stupid, you can ask them if they were exposed to lead at some point. Maybe not if they're really much bigger than you. 1974, the Safe Drinking Water Act was put into place, and that was the first national act to regulate the standards for our drinking water. So up until that time, there were no national standards for a drinking water system. So if the city of Denver was delivering water, they weren't held to any specific national standards. And then this was the first act that required that you had to reach a certain quality of water if you were delivering water to users. And that goes down to pretty small systems. I think if you're in a rural area and you're on a well, it doesn't affect you. But if more than, I think, 10 or 15 people get their water from a single drinking water system, then they have to meet the standards under the Safe Drinking Water Act. In 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed, and actually there was a Clean Water Act dating way back until there was a federal Clean Water or Federal Water Pollution Act way back in 1948, but as far as a real modern act that required permits for discharges, and this is a classic discharge of pollution into a waterway. There was no requirement that you have a permit for that until the 1972 Clean Water Act. And the idea, the goal of the Clean Water Act, and you know, a lot of things led up to that, but one of the most famous ones was, I actually forget the year, I think it was in the 60s, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught on fire. And that's when people thought, well, we really need to do something about water pollution and these industrial discharges into our rivers. And so the Clean Water Act did not say that you could not pollute or discharge pollution into a waterway. It just said you had to have a permit for it. And the permit system was then tried to manage the amount of pollution that could go into any specific waterway. Because under the Clean Water Act, each state is responsible for designating a use of the waters in its state. So a state could say, like, this river, we want that to be clean enough for fishing. This river, we want it to be clean enough for swimming. It doesn't have to be clean enough for drinking. But whatever the state would designate as a use, then the permits for any discharges into that water body would have to make sure that they limited the amount of pollution that went into that water body such that that use could be attained. And a lot of politicians at the time that this was passed said, in 10 years, we want all the waters in the United States good enough to drink, good enough to fish in, good enough to swim in. Well, never really quite reached that, but we have improved the water quality of the water in the United States dramatically since this law was put into place.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is the water quality standard for the Platte River that goes through Denver?
That's a darn good question. I think it's recreational and warm water fish, but I'm not positive. I'm not a water quality guy. They talk a lot about, there's different classes of water. You can have recreational, you can have drinking water untreated, you can have drinking water that requires treatment, and then you can have aquatic life to support aquatic life, and recreational, which is basically swimmable. So of these three, drinkable, fishable, swimmable, which would you think is the more strict? Which would require the least amount of pollution? Yeah, drinking, you would think. But actually, fishable, in order to be a good fishable stream, then you have to have fish, right? And so that sometimes with certain contaminants, like some metals, like zinc and copper, if you have just a tiny amount that doesn't seem to affect humans in any way, it can basically kill off a fish population. And we see this a lot in the mountains here in Colorado because we have mining sites. And the mining sites have lots of metals, copper and zinc. And a little bit of zinc doesn't hurt a human. In fact, we need trace amounts of zinc and trace amounts of copper in our diet. But when you start getting more of that and it goes into a waterway, well, zinc and copper are active ingredients in insecticides. So if you get too much of that coming off a mine site and it goes into the creek, then it'll kill off the fish. And we drink water, humans drink water, 2 or 3 liters a day on average, but a fish has to breathe it all day long, 24/7, 365. So sometimes the fishable standards are really very tough. Okay, and then in the 1980s, we had a couple of major laws that affected hazardous waste. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and everyone calls it RCRA for the acronym, managed how hazardous waste was handled. Prior to this law, if you owned a business, you might hire a company to come and take your hazardous waste. So say you have a car manufacturing business and you use a solvent to clean parts. That spent solvent would get hauled away, and you could have a contractor come and haul it away. Well, there are lots of instances where that contractor would come pick it up, but they might just take it to an abandoned lot and dump it. So one of the things that the RCRA law put into place was a requirement that you had to track that hazardous waste from cradle to grave. So if I'm that car company, then I would have to sign a manifest saying that I'm turning over this hazardous waste to Acme Company to haul it away. Then Acme Company would have to take it to a licensed disposal facility where it was either destroyed or buried in a supposedly leak-proof disposal area. And then he would also have to get a manifest signature on that, say that it went from the cradle to its ultimate disposition and it just didn't get dumped in a back alley. The RCRA Act also required certain storage requirements, saying that you basically couldn't have mounds of storage because we had a number of places where a number of facilities that would generate hazardous waste, stack it up way high, and then maybe they just go out of business, and then thousands of drums are left on a site for someone for the government and the taxpayers to have to clean up. Then the other big hazardous waste law, and this was a hazardous waste site cleanup law, was and this is a mouthful, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, CERCLA, or more commonly known, the Superfund. And this was the law to clean up abandoned hazardous waste sites, because after over 100 years of industrialization, there were a lot of sites associated with a lot of them were associated with chemical manufacturing, but also mining, obviously, and those sites were abandoned and affecting water quality, affecting air quality. And this is a picture of the Love Canal. This was a whoops. Oh, it's a smartboard, huh? Jumped way ahead of me.
It goes backwards.
So the Love Canal was a housing development that was built upon a bunch of old disposal trenches. A chemical company manufactured chemicals for years, dumped them in these disposal trenches out back, and then they went bankrupt and people forgot about it, and this housing development was built right on top of it. And that was basically the poster child for the Superfund law, because the company was out of business. There was no way that the residents could sue them to get their neighborhood cleaned up. So the Superfund law was passed, and the Superfund, they called it the Superfund because it was this giant pot of money that was collected by a tax on chemical feedstocks. So chemical companies had to pay a tax on their raw materials, and that tax went into this Superfund, and the Superfund was then used to clean up abandoned hazardous waste sites across the country. And then in the middle 80s, EPA, this actually wasn't a law, but I included this. The EPA established an Office of Wetlands Protection. And wetlands protection, the average American will look at something like this and call it a swamp. And I think I included this just because it's important. People, I don't think, realize how important swamps are. For many years, people would, for I think the history of the country, people look at swamps and say, well, that's just a mosquito breeding ground, and wouldn't it be great if we could just fill that in and build a Kmart parking lot? But in the 80s, people really started to understand, scientists really started to understand and communicate the importance of wetlands, because they're natural systems that naturally purify water. So, so you can spend millions of dollars to purify water, or you can leave the wetland in place so it can naturally purify water for free. And it's also a great flood control mechanism. As we fill in more of these wetlands across the country, we realize that the communities that were downstream of those wetlands started flooding more, because wetlands have a great capacity to soak up rainwater and hold it and release it very slowly. But if you fill that in and put a parking lot on top of it, then it'll release very quickly and cause flooding. And then very later in the 80s, we had the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. And this was expressly due to the Bhopal disaster. There was a chemical plant in Bhopal, India, that was run by an American company called Union Carbide. They're now called Dow Chemical, one of the biggest chemical companies in the world. But in, what was the date on the Bhopal disaster? I think it was 1984. This chemical plant blew up and killed about, or at least In 1984, it released 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, which is not a nice chemical, and killed about 4,000 people in the town of Oak Hall. In response to that, the United States passed a law saying that if you had, that basically you had to report how much hazardous material you keep on site, so that community planners around you could know whether you have huge amounts of dangerous chemicals at your facility, at your factory, and make planning provisions for that. And then, I'm getting close to the end here actually. In 1987, this was not a law, but it's important because it was the first national treaty, environmental treaty, that EPA entered into internationally, the Montreal Protocol that President Reagan signed, and that was an agreement with other countries to phase out the use of chlorofluorocarbons, which were the chemical used largely in refrigeration, in air conditioners, and in refrigerators, and it destroys the ozone layer. So this has been a remarkably successful treaty, and we are really reversing the damage to the ozone layer. So it's certainly a milestone in environmental protection. You know, and that kind of brings us to today. I would argue that EPA and the Congress in the United States have done all the easy things we can do, or all the easier things we can do to protect the environment, but we still have enormous environmental challenges. And people don't think of nutrients as a big environmental challenge, but homeowners put lots of fertilizer on the ground, farmers put lots of fertilizer on their ground, on their crops, and then the rain washes. We tend to, as a society, especially homeowners, we tend to over-fertilize our lawns, and farmers tend to put more fertilizer than they need to on their crops, and it washes into the rivers, and it's full of nitrogen and phosphate, two things that really encourage plant growth. So what you get is big blooms of algae, because you get all these nutrients now going into the rivers and lakes. And then those blooms of algae decay, and organisms eat the algae, and they use up all the oxygen in the water, and all the fish dies. You know, have anybody heard of the dead zone that's at the mouth of the Mississippi River? There's a enormous, many square mile dead zone where nothing can live at the mouth of most rivers actually in the world, and they're growing every summer because of more and more use of nutrients of fertilizers and other types of nutrients that then wash into the waterways. And then carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels, and I know you've all heard of global warming. Carbon dioxide traps heat, basically, and that's been well known for over a century. And as we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it traps more heat than normally would leak off back into space. And then big issues about resource depletion. We're depleting resources in almost every area. What did I do here? Anybody want to give me an example of some resources that are being depleted? How many on time?
It's probably after 9.
In a minute.
So, anytime. Yeah.
Anybody want to give me an example of a resource that's being depleted? Depletion. Oh, okay. So a resource that's running out, that we only have so much of.
Maybe
Oil. Oil's a good one. Oil's a very good one. Water, especially here in the western United States, we have a very arid climate, and what we're finding with climate change is that that our water supplies, well, we're having more and more drought, so we're having more and more areas where we're not getting as much rainfall or snowfall as we used to in the past. There are studies that suggest that for every degree Fahrenheit that the temperature increases, that farmers will need 15% more water to raise the crops that they're currently raising now with a certain amount of water. So here in the western United States, where I have limited water, drought is a huge issue, and climate change really helps that, or really exacerbates that, makes that worse. So oil and water, you know, just about everything. Wood, you could save. A lot of forests are being logged unsustainably or being logged faster than they can grow back. Mining, a lot of mineral deposits. We're using mineral deposits faster than they can be taken out of the ground in a sensible manner. Rare earths we put in our iPhones. And I'm a culprit. I have an iPhone, but they come from very from very specific places in the world, like the Congo, where they're mined very quickly without thinking about the effects on local water supply and agriculture. So there's a lot of things that we're doing that we can't do in the long term. We really need to think more about our resources and reusing them rather than depleting them as fast as we can. Okay, so I'll leave it at that.
That's great, Tim, and at the end we'll have time for questions, so students might be thinking about what you said and have some questions at
Sure.
the end after Dave's done.
Sure.